for the listeners, who are you?
Well, I'm Zainab, as you'd said. I'm just a 19-year-old student from Manchester, but I also do loads of spoken word poetry. I write loads and loads all the time, and yeah, that's just my main passion, my main hobby, and it's a way for me to just express who I am and express what I feel. Yeah.
Cool. So obviously I've seen your Instagram, seen some of your work. I'd say a lot of it is pertaining to you and your heritage. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. I feel like I've only come into it more now. It sounds weird, but it wasn't an eat, pray, love situation. Like, I went abroad and I was like, oh my goodness, I've just had a transformation. It wasn't like just going back to the homeland and being like, oh my goodness, I've got to write. I was always kind of ingrained in Desi culture, and I grew up like speaking Urdu as like my first language and then learning English. But maybe because I was so accustomed with my culture, I didn't realize how much I could utilize it, not in like a very sort of utilitarian or capitalist way, of course, but like I kind of wanted to follow the mode of, like Robert Frost and Caroline Duffy, all these other poets. And then suddenly I was like, I kept hearing from poets, write what you know. And I was like, okay, I'll write about daffodils or something. I like what I see and everything. But then I was like, if I'm writing about what I know, I think I should write about what I've kind of learnt from birth, almost, it feels. So a lot of my stuff is now to do with being Pakistani and the sort of like the positives, the negatives, uphill, downhill, sort of whatever goes on in my life, almost, yeah.
And it must be quite daunting to start doing that when, there are obviously people out there who are doing this, who are from South Asian backgrounds and are making poetry and are about that, but they're quite hard to find and they're few and thin. So it must be quite daunting to enter into that space when, like you say, everyone around you, especially in the UK, Manchester, is doing stuff relating to their, like, say, what they know, which
Absolutely.
Isn't necessarily
what I would. Yeah, so it's I kind of felt more the outsider, like, as I always hear about people feeling the outsider when they're growing up, that they weren't like other kids because they were like they were black or they were Asian or whatever, and they kind of always want to be like non-POC almost. And I kind of got that like as I came into uni, almost, that I felt more the outsider in my own hometown, going to uni in Manchester with other people coming in and being very questioning of my culture when I express myself through my poetry. So you're right in like there is a certain expectation of what poetry is meant to be, and then when people put their identity into it and it's not something people assume to be aligned to the norm, it throws up an idea of like, I want to probe this, I want to question this, and at the same time, are we comfortable with letting people probe it, or do we just want to state our fact and state our truth and let people sit with it almost as well? Because it's painful to have to explain what we go through on a daily basis sometimes, and our like history, our tragedies that have made us, whether we're Pakistani, Indian, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, whatever we are, we come from a lot of pain, I feel like, as an ethnic minority groups. So it's kind of that dichotomy of like, do I explain what do I, or do I just like let them sit with it and let them take it in and see how they react almost as well?
Yeah, it's sort of similar to whenever there's a surge in racial awareness, for example. I think the most recent one was probably the BLM in mid 2020, and then you've got all these people who I think a lot of them probably have good intentions. Absolutely. But they sort of look to black people or people of colour to teach them about racism, when obviously I get that they want to obviously educate themselves and know about it. Absolutely. But that doesn't have to come from the horse's mouth.
No, and a lot of people try and say that the whole us saying that Google is free or like you need to do your own research is hurtful in a way, when in reality we have always been the subject. We have always been the sort of like subjugated individual that has been put in the spotlight. Because Audre Lorde had said, Audre Lorde's a fantastic poet and black writer, and she had said about how the black woman is like both visible and invisible, in the sense that she is one of the most oppressed like figures in American history, and yet she will not be acknowledged for who she is. Of course, she will never be given a voice. So that's kind of like it. Yeah, it's really, really difficult to have to tell them that as much as we admire how much you want to help us, we don't need white saviors. We don't need a white knight coming through, and then it just falls into the idea that they have a lot of fragility around how we feel about them, because they are what we see as the norm, and the norm is always superior, of course. So it's a really troubling sort of idea, and the fact is, like, if we don't address it and teach it to our youth, I feel like as well it could just tumble into something even worse, or it could go better. We never know. So that's what I try and do with my art, especially. Yeah,
sure. Would you say that you have any inspiration from the West, or is it the diaspora in the West?
Yeah, it's kind of both. So I told you that I study English literature, and I do classic literature on the side with my major, main degree, and Greek mythology is a huge part of kids' upbringing a lot of time, because like a lot of Greek writing is very much the basis of loads of stories in all sorts of cultures throughout the world. And I feel like Homer, Sappho, they're all like poets who kind of deal with both human emotion, but how human emotion sort of retains to divine beings, to monsters and everything. And there's always the idea of like the outsider who is kind of not respected. So either they're completely outcasted, or they kind of learn from. So you can think of like Hercules, who was never sort of accepted, and I kind of see like how he then had to go through so many trials to then be accepted within Greece, and then become like in the position that he is like solidified in mythology. So I'd say a lot of Greek myth, especially how women are portrayed in Greek myth, because that is a tale as old as time, that women never get the best experience, of course. And anyone who has done or sort of read Percy Jackson or read sort of Greek mythology knows Greek women are never given a break ever. So I'd say a lot of mythos. And for diaspora sort of in the West, I'd say a good friend of mine who actually came on the show 2 weeks ago, Amna, she introduced me more to Riz Ahmed, who is, I think, every South Asian kid's, if you've not delved into him, I say, like, where have you been? Secondly, go ahead and dive into him, because he's brilliant at what he does. And he is by far one of the first artists that I've seen kind of come out of that sort of quiet conversation we have with each other, that like, yeah, we're experiencing racism, yeah, we've suffered with the tragedy and the consequences of colonialism, and then there's always like a quiet at the end of the conversation, and we sigh and we have to accept that that's what's happened, and like that's apparently going to continue. But the fact that Riz kind of steps up so much and shows us like these sort of microaggressions and questions, they're so deeply rooted in just like a lot of like internal prejudice within like households within Britain, within the institutions as well. So he's brilliant. I love his work. I'd say people like Rupi Kaur as well. I feel like everyone kind of has a really interesting Rupi Kaur phase. I think she's genius in the sense that she's obviously seen a market for poetry that was coming about with social media, and people like to argue that, oh, it's not real poetry though, it's just like little snippets and everything. But like, poetry is so subjected to like what you think, whatever you want it to be. Spoken word, lyric poetry, songs are sometimes considered poetry as well. So, and I think she was the first poet I read where I related with a lot of the South Asian sort of features within there as well. So talking about like food, culture, dancing and like the attire we wear and everything. She was like the first sort of woman to put that on paper for me. Yeah, and I'd say Worcestershire. I got to meet her recently as well, and if you don't know, she's worked with Beyonce, so like what else do I need to say about? And she's written loads about women of ethnic minority and their sort of tragedy and trauma. So I'd say
cool.
Them, yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's really nice to also give any of the listeners who might not know where to start if they're interested
Absolutely.
in that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So we're going to come to you in a second for a reading of one of your own poems.
Yes.
But before that, it's my understanding that one key area of your of interest to you is partition. So I just wanted to know, like, why is that, and how do you kind of make art out of that?
Yeah, partition, obviously, for South Asian, even children of South Asian parents, or just people who come from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or people who were born here, they have undoubtedly heard about the tragedy that was partition. And I think what sort of interested me the most was it's so silenced within British history almost. It feels like when I went to high school, I was very privileged enough to learn about slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s in America, the genocide and complete erasure of Indigenous Americans, and suffragette movement. I learned so much, but then when I came into college, I was so shocked to realize I had not once learned about partition in my education. And I was a big history freak. I loved history so much, and I was so appalled at myself that I kind of felt like I betrayed some part of me. And it's this idea that I think I was maybe like 14 or 15 when I realized Pakistan didn't exist until 1947, which is so bizarre. And I wonder if I were to ask a kid who is proudly Pakistani, goes and watches cricket, wears the shirts and everything, and say to him, like, you do know, like, Pakistan is only like 75 years old, like, what would their reaction be? So I feel like maybe it's just the miseducation that kind of pushed me forward, but at the same time, it's the sort of the billions of people that were misplaced and the lives that were lost, of course, as well. And the idea of how easy it was for the British to sort of let it happen almost. So they kind of just, I always say that is literally just like done during afternoon tea, because they're literally just a lawyer that they got from here, and they were literally like, draw a line for and they just went and drew a line. And I was like, okay, well, I've heard of worse ways, I guess, to sort of indict political sort of decisions, but like that was very shocking. And it's that thing of like, I'll go back to Riz Ahmed in his poem, his spoken word, Where Are You From? He says, you only built a piece of this place, the rest was us. It's this idea that we funded so much of the British Empire. A lot of the buildings we see now that were maybe made in like the 17th and 18th century, we have to think, where does that money come from? It comes from like the slave trade. It comes from trading with India for spices and clothing and everything. And so I feel like partition is a scar, of course, of all that we kind of, or all our ancestors have put effort into, only to like become a broken country where there was conflict before, but now it's just raw and just like there's so much sort of self-loathing, beloathing for your neighbor, and hatred to the West, hatred for yourself, and it sort of feels like it's still alive almost, and that pain kind of continues to this day. And this year we're going to celebrate 75 years of partition. Can we say celebrate? I don't know at the same time, because it's so harrowing to read about, and when people experience, like when they get to read about it as well. So yeah, I'd say it's awful that we have to, as people of colour, bring a lot of our work through from like tragedy and from horrific events, but that kind of is what makes us it makes us stand out quite a lot in the whole market, if you want to say that it is more marketable strategy, which unfortunately it is, but it's something that shouldn't be ignored and should have been sort of promoted more throughout my life, throughout people's life in general, to see that like this is the tragedy that we're coming from. And just because you feel that we're coming into your communities, even though we're sharing our culture and we're like inviting you into our homes, inviting you to dinner, you don't understand how much we were completely eradicated, like they tried to eradicate us almost. So you don't understand like the amount of pain that we come from, like through our blood and like through the bodies that were like displaced in war, famine, and just being split apart. For sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard, like I'm sure you just witnessed in the past 15 seconds to actually try and condense that all into one. But yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's really good that you're making something positive as well out of something that can be seen as overwhelmingly negative in terms of all the lives that were lost, displaced, etc. Right, so we're gonna get into hearing a piece of yours now. Cool.
So I'll be reading a poem called Uncivilised, so that might evoke some sort of memories of what's been happening over the past few days. But yeah. Uncivilised. I am in all my imperfections a third world country. My nose bleeds and dries into crusts around a nose pin like monsoon-soaked dirt plastered on brown water pots. Handprints on its curves like you caressed a woman's hips. I shine in the field like a gura full of blessings. My shalwar kameez is all the bashful colours of a saint's shrine. There is no imperial marble carving hollow eyes and outreaching fingers. We dance and flutter our feet to Ranja's flute and disperse into petals on their tomb. I cup my hands and beg that my verses are worth anything. Wash and boil off the dirt of a vile island in the fresh dye of Dubatta Gully so I can be proud of my skin again. I am mixed into waters of heritages, murky with invasion and aching. Sheikh and Janjua, Punjabi, Lahori, Anarkali, Beti. I will emerge like Venus from the Chenab. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I feel privileged that I got my own. Well, I know obviously we're broadcasting to people, but I got my own live performance.
Oh, thank you. Oh my days.
No, I really enjoyed that. So knowing that, I feel like when listening to stuff like that, it's like I want to take it and analyze each line.
Yeah.
So like for anyone who's listening and wants to maybe read some of your work, is there anywhere online to go and get it?
Yeah, so I am mostly active on Instagram. I'm trying to bring up my Twitter, but it's a slow progress. But I'm available on a very interesting username, dark.academia.zainab. It's kind of to do with the aesthetic of dark academia that I've tried to make more Pakistani, essentially, because it's very much the Eurocentric academic aesthetic, but a lot of my live performances are on there, and some published work, unpublished stuff, and most of it now is pretty much about me being this season. It's not something I'm quiet about. But yeah, if listeners want to go ahead and have a look, yeah, for sure.